This is a sample lesson from the NCE prep course. For the entire lesson and more, visit counseloracademy.net. Welcome to the Human Growth and Development lesson. Before we get into the major theories, let's do an overview of human development. Human development is a study of how people grow and change over time. So change over time can be due to biological factors, social factors, or cognitive factors. These are not the only factors that influence human development, but these are typically the focus of the theories that we are going to cover. Some human development theories focus on early life, while others focus on later life. And of course, there are theories that focus on life from birth to death. So there are two major arguments in human development. The first one is the issue of nature versus nurture, and then the second one is the issue of continuity versus discontinuity. Let's get into nature versus nurture. The nature view of human development suggests that human development is primarily influenced by pre-written or inherited traits. So biological factors, genetic factors. The nurture viewpoint suggests that humans grow in development due to experiences that they have throughout their life. So they learn, they observe, they grow. Then there's the continuity versus discontinuity argument. If you take the continuity viewpoint, you would say that growth and development happen gradually over time. It's kind of like looking at human development as a slope. It's all connected and there's not really an abrupt change that occurs. Everything is kind of gradual and steady. And the past is typically linked to the future. So for example, when children learn a language, they don't all of a sudden start speaking. They start with babbling, and then they may say one word, and then they may say two words. And typically the sounds that they have when they start babbling influence the sounds that they use when they say their words. And then as they develop more sounds, they'll develop more words. So it's all kind of related. The past is related to the future. Same thing with grammar. You can also think about it as how children grow in terms of height. Children don't typically go to sleep being 2 feet tall and wake up at 3 feet tall. Usually it's a gradual development that takes place over time. They had to grow from 2'1" to 2'2" in order to get to 3 feet. So that's continuity. Discontinuity suggests that human development happens in stages. There's this abrupt growth that happens, and it's usually not related to what happened in the past. And humans may go from one stage to another regardless of what happened in the previous stage. So you can think of discontinuity as more of a staircase versus the slope view of continuity. Continuity is continuous and gradual, and discontinuity is discontinued, kind of like a staircase. So let's look at the types of human development. In psychology, the two major focuses of human development are psychosexual and psychosocial. So psychosexual should make you think of Freud, and psychosocial should make you think of Erik Erikson. And if you don't think of them, that's okay, because we're going to get into their theories pretty shortly. So let's get into some of the other types of human development. There is cognitive development, which is the way that people think. Typically, language development falls under the category of cognitive development. There is behavioral development, attachment theories or attachment development, social learning development, which automatically makes me think of Bandura. We'll also talk about Bandura shortly. Sociocultural and moral development. These are not the only types of human growth and development, but these are the ones that we will be focusing on because they are usually found on the exam. So let's start with Freud. So Freud has these 5 stages, OAPLG. For the exam, it's not enough just to know OAPLG. It's not enough to know oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. You need to know the ages and what happens during each phase. So Let's get into this. The oral stage happens between 0 and 1 years, and during this stage, the focus is on oral stimulation. This happens through feeding. So if you think about a baby, 0 to 1, most of what they do is eat. Eating is primarily the task that they're mastering. Breastfeeding, using a bottle, those kinds of things. And it is said that if there are issues during this stage, a child will grow up to have an oral fixation. The next stage is the anal stage. So this occurs from 1 to 3 years. The focus of this stage is anal stimulation. So typically, potty training is the major task that happens between 1 and 3 years of age. And if there are issues during this stage, typically a person will have what is called an anal fixation. So the third stage is the phallic stage. This happens between 3 and 6 years old, and the major task that usually occurs is masturbation. So children do not typically masturbate for sexual pleasure. It is usually an exploration of their body. They, at this age, usually become aware of the fact that they have something between their legs, and they become aware that they are different from other people. Boys are different from girls, or what I have is different than what mommy or daddy has. So they are exploring their body. Issues during this stage may result in what's called the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex. So in pop culture, people are pretty familiar with the Oedipus complex. This is basically when a boy is in love with his mother, and the Electra complex is when a female is in love with their father. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a romantic love, but it is kind of an obsession or almost an objectification of the parent. So a little boy may want his mother's attention, and he is kind of fixated on that, and as a result he may feel frustration toward his father. The same thing with a little girl. She may be fixated on attention from her father, and as a result have tension with her mother. And this isn't something that the children are aware of. This is not something that always occurs. And keep in mind that this is Freud's theory. This is not necessarily a fact for everyone. This is just based on his theory. Let's get into latency stage. This stage occurs between 6 and 12 years, and there is no major task or sexual development that occurs in this stage. Finally, the genital stage. This occurs from 12 years on, and the focus of this stage is genital stimulation. Freud had this concept of the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the part of a person that is driven by desire. So this person is the one that says, I want this thing right now. I want to play. I want pizza. I want sex. I want to sleep. This is the impulsive part of a person. The superego is typically described as the moral part of a person, the good part. So this is the part of you that says, no, good people don't think about those things. You shouldn't do that. This is bad. Don't do that. This is also the part of you that drives guilt and anxiety about certain thoughts or behaviors. And then there is the ego. The ego is the part of the person that says, hey, let's figure this out. So it is the mediator between your desires and your moral compass. You can think of the id and the superego as the devil and the angel on two sides of your shoulders, and then the ego is you trying to mediate between the two. And the reason that I bring this up is because, like I said, the superego is the moral compass of a person, and the superego typically is what causes people to have what is called a defense mechanism, because we're avoiding feelings of guilt, feelings of anxiety about having certain desires or about even doing certain things. We develop what is called a defense mechanism. What is a defense mechanism? So, like I said, defense mechanism is mostly subconsciously used to protect from feelings of anxiety or guilt. We don't just use defense mechanisms when we're feeling guilty or anxious. We also use them when we feel threatened or when our superego becomes too demanding. Freud came up with many defense mechanisms, and it's not necessary that you know all of them, but what I've done is created 2 tables for you on this slide and the next. These slides include the defense mechanisms that are most likely to appear on the test. The first and most likely to be asked about defense mechanism is projection. Projection is basically when you attribute negative thoughts toward others and oneself. If a person has a negative thought, their superego tells them it's bad to have that thought. You shouldn't think that. And so what the person will do is they'll start to think somebody else is having that thought. For example, you might think that somebody is ugly. Your superego tells you that it's mean or it's bad to think that somebody else is ugly. So what you will do subconsciously is start to believe that that person thinks you're ugly, or that that person themselves thinks that they're ugly. The next defense mechanism is repression. Repression is employed by the ego. Most of the defense mechanisms are subconscious and they are employed by the superego, but this is one of the ones that is usually due to the ego taking over. Repression basically keeps disturbing thoughts and memories out of the unconscious. This is an unconscious process. The person is not aware that they're doing it, and a lot of times they are completely unaware of the disturbing thought or memory that their brain is actually trying to keep out of their unconscious. The next one related to repression is suppression. So this is actually a conscious defense mechanism. It is the only conscious defense mechanism. So this is something that a person may actively be doing. They're actively stopping or trying to forget disturbing thoughts or feelings. If a bad thought comes up, the person may try to distract themselves. They may try to think of other thoughts. They may stop the thought. Or they may tell themselves something positive so that they don't go down a path of negative thoughts. This is something that people do intentionally, actively, but automatically. The next defense mechanism is sublimation. Sublimation is when a person redirects negative or strong thoughts or feelings or desires to more positive or safe or acceptable thoughts or feelings or behaviors. A common example that I've seen is a person who enjoys or has the desire to hurt people will pursue a career as a doctor or a surgeon. They're taking their negative desire, which is to hurt people, and they are putting it to something more socially acceptable, which is being a surgeon, and they still get to make incisions, which fulfills that desire to harm people. The next defense mechanism is displacement. This is redirecting strong emotions toward something else that doesn't really feel threatening. So a common example is somebody has a bad day at work and they come home and they yell at their children. You can't yell at your boss because your superego tells you no, or your ego will tell you no. So you go home and you yell at your children because there is less of a consequence if you do that. The next defense mechanism is regression. Regression is when somebody reverts back to behaviors or patterns that occurred during earlier development. So this is usually something that happens when people are faced with stress. And this is when the id takes over control. An example of this would be if a person has a major surgery and they are in a lot of pain, stress, they're scared, they may wet the bed. Another example of this is if a person is faced with a very stressful or overwhelming emotion, they may cry like a child. They may, sit on the floor and rock back and forth. This is a sample lesson from the NCE prep course. For the entire lesson and more, visit counseloracademy.net.